The microphone sat on the table between them like a live grenade, and the reporter's hand shook slightly as he reached forward to adjust it, his fingers brushing the cold metal before pulling back as if he'd touched something he shouldn't have. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday in November 1964, inside a suite at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach, and Frank Sinatra sat in a leather chair by the window, bourbon in one hand, cigarette in the other, watching the reporter with an expression that gave away nothing while the tape recorder's reels turned silently, capturing every breath, every pause, every moment of the tension that had been building since the reporter walked in 20 minutes earlier and asked the question that no one was supposed to ask. The reporter's name was Gerald McKinney, 32 years old, worked for the Miami Herald, had been covering the entertainment beat for 6 years, had interviewed dozens of celebrities, but none of them had looked at him the way Frank Sinatra was looking at him now, not angry, not dismissive, just waiting. McKinney had prepared for this interview for 2 weeks, written out questions, researched Sinatra's career, his albums, his films, his relationships. But all of that preparation evaporated the moment Sinatra answered the door himself. No publicist, no manager, just Frank in shirt sleeves and slacks, gesturing for McKinney to come in and sit down without so much as a handshake or a greeting, just a nod toward the chair and a look that said, "You're here now, so get on with it." The first 15 minutes had been fine. Standard questions about the new album, the upcoming tour, working with Count Basie, the kind of softballs that McKinney knew would make good copy but wouldn't make interesting copy. And Sinatra had answered them all with the practiced ease of someone who'd done 1,000 interviews and could give you exactly what you wanted without giving you anything real. But then McKinney had asked about the photograph that had run in the Herald 3 weeks earlier, showing Sinatra at a table in the Eden Rock with 3 men in expensive suits, one of whom had been identified by the FBI as a known associate of organized crime figures in New York and Chicago, and the caption had implied, carefully, legally, but unmistakably, that Sinatra's connections to certain individuals raised questions about his character, his judgment, his fitness to be performing at venues that catered to families and respectable people. McKinney hadn't written the article, but he'd been assigned to follow up on it, to get Sinatra's response, to ask him directly about the allegations that had been swirling around him for years. And when he'd asked, phrased it carefully, diplomatically, "Mr. Sinatra, there have been some questions raised about your association, and I was wondering if you'd like to address them." Sinatra had set down his bourbon very slowly, very deliberately, and for the last 3 minutes had been sitting in complete silence, just looking at McKinney with those blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to the back of his skull. "You want me to address them," Sinatra said finally, his voice quiet, almost conversational, and McKinney nodded, trying to keep his breathing steady, trying to look professional instead of terrified. "Yeah, I think it would be good for your readers to hear your perspective," McKinney said, and he hated how his voice sounded, too eager, too desperate to fill the silence. Sinatra took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and the smoke hung in the air between them like a curtain. "Let me ask you something, Gerald. Can I call you Gerald?" McKinney nodded. "Sure, Mr. Sinatra. Let me ask you something, Gerald. When you walked into this hotel today, who did you see in the lobby?" McKinney blinked, confused by the question. "I'm sorry. The lobby, who was down there?" McKinney thought about it. "I don't know, guests, staff, people." "People," Sinatra repeated. "Right. And did you take photographs of all those people? Did you write down their names? Did you run background checks to see if any of them had questionable associations?" "No, of course not." "Why not?" "Because I wasn't there to write about them. I was here to interview you." "Exactly," Sinatra said, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made McKinney want to push his chair back. "You were here to interview me, because I'm Frank Sinatra, because people care what I do and who I talk to and where I eat dinner. But here's the thing, Gerald. I don't get to choose who sits at the table next to me in a restaurant. I don't get to run background checks on every person who comes up to shake my hand. I don't get to control who's in the room when I walk into a club, and neither do you. The difference is, nobody's taking pictures of you when it happens." McKinney felt his throat tighten. "With respect, Mr. Sinatra, you're a public figure. There's a different standard." "A different standard," Sinatra interrupted. and now there was an edge under the calm. That's a nice way of saying I don't have the same rights as everyone else. That because I sing for a living because people buy my records, I'm supposed to account for every person who's ever been in the same room as me. That's not what I'm saying. Then, what are you saying? McKinney looked at his notes, at the questions he'd written out, at the carefully constructed phrases that were supposed to make this easy, but none of them seemed right anymore. I'm saying that the photograph raises questions. That people see you with these individuals and they wonder. They wonder what? If I'm a criminal. If I'm part of some organization. If I'm doing something illegal. They wonder about your judgment. Sinatra laughed, short and sharp. My judgment, okay. Let me tell you about my judgment, Gerald. My judgment is that I've been in this business for 25 years. I've performed in every major city in this country. I've sung for presidents. I've raised millions for charity. I've employed hundreds of people. And in all that time, I've never been arrested, never been charged with a crime, never been convicted of anything. The FBI has investigated me for 15 years and found nothing. Zero. Because there's nothing to find. But none of that matters, does it? Because someone took a photograph of me sitting at a table with men I didn't invite to sit there, and suddenly I have to explain myself to you. Mr. Sinatra, I understand your frustration, but… No, you don't, Sinatra said, and his voice had gone very soft now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. You don't understand, because you're sitting there with your tape recorder and your questions and you think you're doing your job. You think you're holding me accountable. But what you're really doing is perpetuating a narrative that was written before I ever walked into that restaurant. You decided I was guilty the moment you saw that photograph. And now you're here, giving me the opportunity to defend myself against accusations that were never made explicitly enough to sue over but are damaging enough to stick. McKinney felt sweat forming on his palms. I didn't decide anything. I'm just asking questions. You're asking questions based on a photograph that shows me sitting at a table. That's it. That's the evidence. I'm sitting at a table. And from that, you and your newspaper have constructed an entire story about my character, my associations, my judgment. Do you know what those men and I talked about that night? No. Neither do I, because I don't remember. Because it wasn't important. Because men come up to me in restaurants all the time. They want to shake my hand. They want to tell me they love my music. They want to buy me a drink. And sometimes I let them sit down for 5 minutes because I'm polite. Because I understand that for some people, meeting Frank Sinatra is a big deal. And you're telling me that because I was polite to some guys in a restaurant, I now have to explain myself to the FBI and the Miami Herald and anyone else who wants to make assumptions about who I am. McKinney looked at the tape recorder. The reels were still turning. Every word was being captured. Mr. Sinatra, I think there's a misunderstanding. No, Gerald. I think there's a very clear understanding. You came here hoping I'd either deny everything, which would make you look like you're holding power to account, or I'd get angry and say something you could quote out of context, which would confirm everything your readers already believe about me. But I'm not going to do either of those things, because I don't owe you an explanation. I don't owe the Herald an explanation. I don't owe anyone an explanation for being photographed in public. So you're refusing to comment. I'm refusing to play this game, Sinatra said. He stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the ocean. You want a comment? Here's a comment. I'm 50 years old. I've been famous for half my life. I've been investigated, scrutinized, photographed, followed, and judged for things I did and things I didn't do and things people assume I might have done. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of having to defend myself against innuendo. I'm tired of being guilty until proven innocent. And I'm especially tired of journalists who think they're doing important work by asking me about a photograph that means nothing. McKinney felt his story slipping away. Mr. Sinatra, if you could just… This interview is over, Sinatra said, his back still to McKinney. You can use whatever you want from what I've said. You can write that I was defensive, evasive, hostile, whatever sells papers, but I'm done. McKinney stood up, gathered his notebook, reached for the tape recorder. Can I ask one more question? Sinatra turned around. What? Do you regret it, being photographed with those men? Sinatra looked at him for a long moment. I regret that we live in a world where sitting at a table makes you guilty by association. I regret that your newspaper cares more about innuendo than facts. And I regret that I wasted 20 minutes of my life on this conversation. McKinney walked to the door, stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, Mr. Sinatra, I think you're probably right. I think the photograph probably doesn't mean anything, but my editor thinks it does, and he's the one who decides what runs. Sinatra picked up his bourbon, drained it. Then you should get better editors. McKinney left. The next day, the Herald ran his story under the headline, Sinatra refuses to address mob connections. The article quoted him selectively. The parts about being tired, about refusing to explain himself, about being done with the conversation, but left out the context, the frustration, the very real point he'd been making about innuendo and guilt by association. McKinney's editor called it good journalism. McKinney called it accurate. Sinatra called his lawyer. 2 weeks later, the Herald ran a retraction. Small, page 17, easily missed. It stated that the photograph in question showed Mr. Sinatra at a public restaurant where he had no control over who else was dining, and that there was no evidence to suggest he had any ongoing relationship with the individuals pictured. Sinatra didn't acknowledge the retraction, didn't call to gloat, didn't do anything. He just kept working, kept performing, kept living his life. But Gerald McKinney noticed something over the next few years. Whenever he tried to get interviews with major celebrities, whenever he called publicists or managers, he'd hit a wall. Not a hard wall. Not anyone saying Sinatra blacklisted you. Just a soft, consistent resistance. Scheduling conflicts. Prior commitments. Maybe next time. It took him 3 years to realize that maybe next time meant never. And it took him another 5 years to understand why. Because in Hollywood, in the world where Frank Sinatra operated, you didn't have to say anything directly. You didn't have to make threats or demands. You just had to let people know quietly, subtly, that someone had been unfair. And the people who mattered would remember. McKinney eventually left journalism, went into public relations, did well for himself. But he never forgot that interview. Never forgot the way Sinatra had looked at him when he'd asked about the photograph. Never forgot the feeling of having all his carefully prepared questions dismantled by a man who understood power better than McKinney understood journalism. Years later, someone asked McKinney if he'd ever regretted the story. He thought about it for a long time. I regret that I let my editor's agenda become my story, he said. I regret that I went in there thinking I was holding power accountable when really I was just perpetuating a narrative. And I regret that I never got the chance to apologize. Why didn't you? McKinney smiled sadly. Because Frank Sinatra doesn't take apologies from people who have already shown him who they are. The question is this. When a reporter walks into your hotel room with a tape recorder and asks you to defend yourself against accusations based on a photograph of you sitting at a table with people you barely remember, and you dismantle his questions so thoroughly that he leaves knowing his story was written before he arrived, is that self-defense? Or is that showing him that he never had the power he thought he did? And when his career quietly stalls over the next decade because doors stop opening and calls stop getting returned, did you punish him? Or did you simply let everyone know what happens when you confuse journalism with character assassination? Because maybe the most devastating thing you can do to someone isn't to destroy them loudly. It's to let them destroy themselves slowly, knowing that every closed door, every unreturned call, every maybe next time, is a reminder that they chose to print innuendo instead of truth, and that some mistakes don't get retracted on page 17, they get remembered forever.